A lot more to talk about. For more on the U.S. policy in Afghanistan, the overall war on terror, and the lessons learned, let me turn to our distinguished panel. Brian Becker, Executive Director of the Answer Coalition and an anti-war activist. Also joining us in the studio, Ahmad Majidyar is a fellow at the Middle East Institute. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. Brian, let me begin with you. Successes and failures since 9/11 and the lessons learned. Did the war in Afghanistan really accomplish anything?
I would have to say no. I lived very close to the World Trade Center at the time of the attack. I had friends who were inside, so like many New Yorkers, there was shock, grief. But I think President Bush cynically, pretextually used the terrible events of that day to not only invade Afghanistan, which had given safe haven to al-Qaeda, and now we have tens of thousands of Afghans dead, in a war that doesn't end, a war that's gone on 16 years, the longest war, but also the U.S. invaded Iraq. The U.S. used this same so-called war on terror against the government in Libya. So now the number of jihadists, there were 400 at the time, 400 al-Qaeda members on September 11th, 2001. Now we have 40,000 members of ISIS 16 years later. Has the U.S. foreign policy worked? I would say absolutely not. It has been a big mistake, in fact, a catastrophe.
Ahmad, was it a catastrophe? And we should add, the United States has not seen the type of attack we saw on September 11th since that awful day.
Yeah, I think that is the biggest achievement of the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, because over the past 16 years, we've not had any significant terror attacks on the U.S. soil emanating from Afghanistan. And the U.S. military presence and also intelligence assets there has allowed the United States that over the past 16 years, not to just oust the Taliban and give hope to the Afghan people, but also to degrade the core al-Qaeda elements in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan. Without the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, we would not have been able to degrade al-Qaeda core, which is still plotting attacks against the United States.
Is al-Qaeda even relevant anymore? I mean, it seems ISIL is taking the headlines. And of course, ISIL was created because of the chaos and instability in Iraq. Brian.
And it was al-Qaeda in Iraq that became ISIS. In other words, if we think of al-Qaeda simply as a brand, we can say, well, that brand is diminished. But its cause, the fight of Islamic extremists and terrorists and jihadi elements, has not been reduced. It's grown. We have to face facts. Maybe the United States hasn't suffered the same kind of terrorist attack as September 11th, but there are terrorist attacks all over Europe and all over the Middle East. Of course, Muslims are the primary sufferers of these kind of extremist terrorist operations. Has the U.S. military response to Afghanistan, to al-Qaeda, to September 11th worked? No one can really reasonably say yes to that if we look at the big picture. 15
of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Is Saudi Arabia being held accountable? Ahmad.
There are, of course, as you mentioned, just most of the attackers on 9/11, they are Saudi officials, but there is no evidence that the Saudi government had any role in the 9/11 attacks. I partly agree with my colleague here that the Iraq war was a mistake, and that allowed al-Qaeda to metastasize. Now, it's not just in Afghanistan, Pakistan theater. We see it across from the Middle East. But the key question right now is that what to be done. And one reason that the al-Qaeda was able to just spread across the Middle East and also the emergence of ISIS, it was some of the mistakes that the United States made in Afghanistan and in Iraq. In Afghanistan, in the early years, when the war in Iraq happened, then Afghanistan became the forgotten war. And similarly, President Obama withdrew all troops from in 2011 from Iraq, which allowed the ISIS and al-Qaeda to re-emerge. That was hasty because the Iraqi security forces were not ready. So that's one key lesson that we should not repeat in Afghanistan.
And you know, so much about terrorism has evolved since the September 11th attacks. I mean, that day it was well coordinated, it was sophisticated, so many people were involved, so many different cities. Now all you have to do is rent a van and a truck. So my question to you is, really, can anyone at any point stop these types of attack with the age of internet and many jihadists becoming radicalized online, with the lone wolf incidents that we've seen? Brian?
I would say no, actually. But again, let's look at the big picture here. The United States government went to war in Arab countries, Muslim countries, in Iraq, in Libya. It supported Islamic extremists in Syria. And at the same time, it demonized all of the secular nationalist governments in the Middle East, like Assad. The U.S. media, the Western media said Assad is killing.
Syria is a complicated issue, Brian.
But here again, we have ISIS in Syria. That's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are there. They're controlling Idlib in northern Syria. They're in Iraq. They've been mainly driven out of Afghanistan. That was accomplished a long time ago. Most of the Afghans who are dying today never heard of September 11th attacks. They don't know about it, and yet their country has become the battlefield. I think the Trump administration is making a big mistake by escalating the U.S. military presence. There is, in fact, no military solution. This is a cycle of violence that keeps repeating, is, in fact, escalating.
Let me let Ahmad have the last word here. Your thoughts on what Brian had to say.
Yeah, I think that the nature of the terrorism threat has changed, and that's why we have to change the strategy too. There is terrorism, whether it's Middle East, whether it's in South Asia or across the world, it is a symptom of the state failures. So we have to focus on building state institutions. But I partly disagree with my colleague that the solution to the problem in the Middle East is dictators like Bashar al-Assad or Saddam Hussein, because they were the reasons which provided the conditions for such actors or non-state terrorist entities to emerge. So that is not the solution.
But ISIS didn't exist when they were actually ruling their countries.
Okay, gentlemen, very quickly, are we safer today than 16 years ago? Yes or no?
Yeah, I think that the fact that we have not had any major terrorist attack on U.S. soil, that means that we are safer today.
I know what you're going to say.
Well, I'm going to say that hundreds of thousands of people around the world have died needlessly because of the U.S. foreign policy, and ultimately this isn't really security.
Brian Becker, Ahmad Majidyar, thank you to you both.